Hey everybody, welcome back to another Like a Ninja live stream. I'm Jonathan Crow, Director of Community at Ninja One, and I have with me two guests who are very kind to take time out of their days. For everybody who is part of our Discord community, hey everybody, thanks for chiming in again or signing in again. This first one who I'm going to introduce is no stranger. We've got Ian Crego. Ian, you're here. You are now listed as Ian Crego in the Discord, but prior to joining Ninja, you were a Discord member, and I believe you're Professor Ion. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. I actually debated wearing the lab coat.
Oh man, I saw like some lab coat icons actually in response to us announcing the stream. That's awesome. Well, Ian, thank you for joining. With that lab coat, I mean, here you are. You're going to be talking about home labs. It seems appropriate. And you brought along a good friend of yours. So we have Brandon Auvdel. And Brandon, thank you for joining.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So Brandon, why don't you give folks who are joining in here a little background on yourself? You know, what are you working on now? And then maybe just a little bit. I know like we're gonna get into your guys, both of your like how you came into working on a home lab and kind of like got first started, but maybe just like a little bit of short background first.
Sure. My name is Brandon. I've been working in tech fields now for probably about 12, 14 years. I've done a little bit of everything, and I think that's kind of where my interest peaks. I like to know how to do a little bit of everything. It's piques my interest to know how to do something. You know, I might not know how to do every facet of that exact thing, but I know enough to be dangerous in a lot of different categories. But in terms of like a home lab setup, it started pretty simple with hey, I need to try to fix a problem I have, and now it's more or less, how many things could I also do on top of this? Not only maybe that fix other problems, or also just for fun, or just to say that I did. So yeah, it's evolved quite a bit over the years.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, you are definitely not alone in describing how you approach things. That you're curious, you want to get your hands in everything. You're definitely not alone here. I want to back up for a second and let everybody, just as a reminder of what we're going to be covering. So we're going to be talking about home labs, obviously, but in addition to kind of going through a little bit of the specs, really want to talk with Ian and Brandon about like, how did they get into it? What were the first things that they challenges they kind of ran into? And so if you are joining this and you're looking into just building out yourself, or maybe you've already gotten started and you're looking for some additional advice and things like that, here you've got two guys who have probably maybe made a mistake or two. I don't know. Maybe not. And have learned from it and would maybe do things a little bit differently if they were starting from scratch the next time around. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We definitely want to get everyone's comments here in the chat. We want to hear from you too. Do you already have a home lab that you've got set up? What are the things that you've been building around? We definitely want to make this a conversation rather than just like a true webinar where we're just talking at you. So yeah, join in the fun. All right. Well, with that, Ian, let's turn it over to you. So like, how did you get into your own foray into building out a home lab? Was it a similar thing? You had something that you just wanted to solve and it started piece by piece, or did you set out one day, you're like, you know what, I'm going to develop a kick-ass home lab?
So, of course, it's never as easy as I'm just going to set out and develop a kick-ass home lab. Though I'd love to pretend that that's what happened. For my case specifically, it was way back, like 10 years ago now. I had some friends that were trying to get me out of what I was doing and into the IT space. And we talked and they convinced me to build a server just to play with stuff. And it was a really, really simple file server. It didn't have Active Directory for a while. And then it spun into that. And then it mostly just sat. And it wasn't something that I used a ton. It was a file server. I tinkered with it. I hosted the occasional Minecraft server, things like that. And it wasn't for another 3 or 4 years that it really, when I got my first IT job, that I really spiraled into like, okay, well, now I want a deeper understanding of all of these things. And so I started expanding on what the home lab did.
Nice. And so as you're building things out, like, again, for folks chiming in, like, or tuning in, if you have some specific questions, go ahead and leave them in the chat. But yeah, for you guys, like, why don't we talk about, oh, here we go.
Well, that's a great
question. Coming with the real question. Coming in hot. Oh, man.
That's great, a really good question.
Yeah. How did you convince your partners to be able to spend so much time on your home lab?
I'll take a stab at that, because it's not even so much that the time is definitely a critical piece, but there's also a monetary value behind that as well, that you have to really, budgetary constraints. You're, especially if you're, I'm married and I have a child. We have a house. We've got all kinds of other things going on. For me, it's because of how it started. It started to solve a problem, and it kind of, as long as there were pieces that were still important to everyone, it kind of worked its way out and over time. But yeah, it's trying to, for me personally, we have Home Assistant. So, pretty standard, part of a home lab these days. You got automation options, a nice little dashboard with everything. My wife personally, she has her own dashboard that it shows her car, her tire pressures. She can start her car from it. It shows us the cameras. She can look at the weather. She can see where everybody's at. It's when you put all that stuff together, you show like the fruits of the labor, right? So she uses it every single day. So she knows that if this didn't exist, and that's kind of the best part. So it does, to kind of go back to the actual question, it's not easy. You have to try to find a way to show everyone that this is going to be worth it in the end. Like, because it's not just push 3 buttons and hey, here it is. This is everything that I ever wanted to do. It's sitting there and troubleshooting until 3 o'clock in the morning because that one thing that seems so easy just isn't working. And
and it's not so easy.
Yep. So
this sounds like similar to convincing your boss or like stakeholders of ROI. Like you have to show them the value, the spouse value, the family value before you invest all this into it.
Yeah, and it's a very real thing. The other thing that yes, easier if you have a semi-technical partner for sure. The other thing that I ran into a lot is the argument started by, babe, why the hell is the internet broken today? Like, what did you do? What did you turn off? Or what broke and why isn't it working? Like, that's the troubleshooting process for the average person's internet, and something that a lot of people are used to is, okay, the internet stopped working. I unplug the router, I plug it back in, and it's probably going to be better now. In my network, and probably in Brandon's network, I have virtual machines that do a lot of the stuff that most people think of a router doing. Plus, there's separate wireless access points, and there's all of these moving pieces that go into the network. So it can be like, there's also a downtime aspect. And then there's managing downtime. Like, for example, with Brandon's wife using Home Assistant, he can't just tinker with Home Assistant whenever now, because if he breaks it, she's going to be upset.
Right. Very true.
And that can definitely be a big part of it. I think that was the hardest part for me. I've been fortunate to have partners that don't mind the money and time aspect so much. But the internet isn't working. That one has gotten me in trouble a couple of times.
Does no deploy Friday apply to home lab use?
If you live alone, probably not. But if you don't live alone, yes, no deploy Friday absolutely applies.
Here's a good question from Chris. What's up, Chris? he often describes himself as the other Chris Thomas because we have an account manager named Chris Thomas. But you know what? I feel like he is the premier Chris Thomas. Thanks for joining, buddy. So he's asking, does anyone else use a disaster recovery environment to toy around as a faux home lab? And this kind of goes into another question too. I have it really goes back to like the use and why you got started in the first place, or why you want to maybe set this up. Is it because it's purely like hobby, personal things you're interested in, or are you setting up to really want to mimic, a professional environment? So you're actually testing, training, deploying some things and really using it more involved with work. But yeah, I'll let you answer Chris's question first.
You want to go or you want me to, Brandon?
Go for it, Ian.
All right. So I think I understand your question correctly, but your disaster recovery environment question, I assume by that you're meaning like just a completely separate parallel to production environment that you're using for lab work. And if that's the case, I kind of did a little bit when I sysadmin to school. It wasn't something I did a lot, partly because I was much more comfortable doing testing in my actual home lab, depending on the level of testing. If it was testing group policy deployment, then I'd probably do it in like a disaster recovery or other adjacent environment at the school. Anything else, though, that was like potentially super catastrophically different, I would probably test here or I guess the other possibility is that, are you asking if like I built my environment to be exactly parallel to the school environment, which I did to a degree. As Jonathan mentioned, one of the questions was like, sometimes you build it to learn something or build something cool. And in my case, when my home lab really blew up, it was to learn something. Like I use Windows Hyper-V instead of VMware or any of the others because that's what we used at the school and that's what I needed to know the best and be most comfortable with. I have no idea if that answers your question. If not, feel free to let me know how it didn't, and I'll, re-answer your question.
Yeah, and I'm interested too, Ian, with like when you were working at the school, and you were making your lab specifically, like there are things you want to test out that you're obviously not going to test out in production, right? Were you getting compensated for that at all, or did that conversation come up with work at all?
So my direct supervisor knew that I had a lab. I typically didn't tell him too much what I was testing in it because a lot of it was for my own learning. But also, I don't think they probably would have compensated me anyway. I feel like most people wouldn't be compensated for it in the case of I have a lab, I'm using it to test work things, because work is probably going to say that we have somewhere that you could have tested that.
Sure.
A case being that the school, we did have, granted, I built it and I'm the one that convinced the school to get it, but we did have a slice of the environment that I had built for testing some things. Not a full testing environment like I would have liked, but I just never had the time to build that out. But then there were definitely some group policy changes that I deployed that could have broke things that I tested at home first. Some of them involving, oh God, I can't think of what it's called, OneDrive. We had some fun OneDrive stuff, some fun like shared drive stuff with local storage or network storage that just, anytime I touched it, I was like, all right, well, I need to make sure that I know exactly how this is going to go first. And so I tinkered around with a lot of that at home.
Gotcha.
But no compensation. Brandon, you want to take a jump at that one too?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing for me personally from like a testing environment. So I still have my original server box that I used to use when I very first started. So if I'm doing something crazy, I will tend to work on that. In terms of, I also do have a couple like Oracle VMs that still spin up every once in a while, like cloud VMs that I can throw things on if I'm really just trying to just see what something does, if it's even going to have any use worth setting up on my network. But for the most part, my home lab stays pretty quiet most times. Obviously, you take a risk of auto updates on things. You never know what's going to break. I actually know one of the things I use very often is set to update a catastrophically new setup in like the next 2 weeks, and everybody's like, I've turned auto update on that just because I'm well aware of it. But obviously there's going to be times where that's not the case because I am security conscious. I like to keep things updated, but at the same time, you got to be a little careful. You don't want to just break everything for weeks just because you didn't notice that, oh, hey, this one thing, this file that it used to read, it's actually over here now, and you didn't know that. And because you can't keep up on 20 VMs worth of documentation on a daily basis when you have an actual job to do as well.
Yep.
Well, that kind of gets into like another area of questions around like what are some things that you had to learn the hard way, I guess, in terms of like you start adding on kind of like piece by piece. It's obviously going to be different than when like you have that experience. You're like, okay, wait, I probably should have set things up like that. Like, are there any things that you would do differently this time around?
I mean, there's a glaring one that I personally use Proxmox as my hypervisor. And it's free to use. There's obviously some paid support plans and things like that, but I don't use like Hyper-V or VMware. I going into it, I knew not a single thing about it. I just knew that that's kind of the route that I wanted to take. So I thought I knew how everything worked, got it all going, and it seemed like it was working fine. I had my first, like my main home assistants, cameras, all that kind of home security stuff. Had that all set up, was working well, and for some reason, I decided to do my NAS, my storage piece, second. And I don't really know why. I thought it probably should have did that first, but I didn't really need to send anything to it. Like this was just going to be like a local file share, and wasn't going anything too crazy. And it wasn't until then I realized that I didn't set up my drives properly. Because I wanted to use a specific file system, and because I didn't do it at the beginning, there wasn't really a way to change it after. So I toyed with the idea of just dealing with it for the longest time because I had already spent hours and hours and hours setting everything else up. And yeah, you can back up VMs and re-import them and things like that. But it was one of those things where I'm not that far, but I'm far enough. Do I just cut my losses right here? Go back, read the documentation that I clearly missed, on how to do this the way that I thought I was doing it in my head, and just cut my losses and restart. And that's what I did. And I'm better for it now, even though I lost probably 24 hours worth of work otherwise, getting things configured. But it was the right thing to do at the time because now everything, I get perfect drive data, everything's, rated the way that I want it to be, and it just works. But that's probably one of the most, and that kind of goes into a more of an overreaching topic that have a plan. Like if you're really going out on it's one thing to start tinkering with something just because you're trying to learn something. But if you're really going out and say, man, I really want to go full in on this. Like I want to have a server and I want to have, everything done the right way. I want this thing to run my entire house. I want it to do everything I can anything I want it to. Have a plan, for starting at the hardware level, what kind of hardware do I need to run this thing? Like, is it going to be good for a year? Is it going to be good for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Like, can I upgrade it? There's a lot of questions just on that side. And then on the software side, what do I need to put in this hardware that is going to do what I need it to? And is it something that I can manage remotely? Is it something that I can, that's going to get constant updates? Is it going to be something that, has security updates? There's so many questions. And I think probably another regret was, and I'm sure Ian was kind of the same way, I just kept adding pieces in my head and never really had it on a plan until it was a little too late. And then you're going back and trying to fix or mold things together to work all together, which is an option. It's just not the best one. So.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, I'm sure like we can get into this more a little bit later, in terms of like lessons you've learned in this regard that can apply to then your professional life and everything. But it seems like, I hear this and I think of people building out their stack, at a
Mm-hmm.
MSP or an IT department. But Ian, yeah, how about you? I mean, in terms of like building out a plan, I would love to dive a little bit deeper into that and talk about like how you can actually do that. Like what's your thought process in terms of like, if you're going to start over now, how would you build out your plan?
So, one, I want to second what Brandon said specifically about file storage. I think that that's a common, like, I set up and configured my NAS second, and now I have regrets. Because I did the same thing at one point. I had built out a bunch of stuff and then I added an NAS, and I was like, okay, and now I have it configured this way. And I just kind of did it off the top of head without looking back at other things I was going to want to connect to the NAS. And it, regrets. I had to rebuild a bunch of stuff or potentially rebuild the NAS. The biggest mistake that I made with the NAS was not not properly considering the RAID configuration I was going to want to use in the long term when I built it. Because when I built it, it was an old computer I had, and I didn't really have a ton in the way of spare drives, and I should have built it with the intent of having one of the 2 drives that I did have be a RAID drive, even though it meant I had less storage, so that I didn't later have to come back and add that RAID drive in. Fortunately, the NAS software that I use, or the NAS OS that I use, allowed me to do that, to add it in after the fact. But I think it was a 32-hour process to build like the RAID, to write the RAID out, during which time the NAS was basically unusable because all of its processing power and the drive write power and read power was just doing that. In terms of NAS recommendations, that's a really good question. So I use, holy crap, why don't I remember? I was going to recommend Synology. I really, really like Synology. I've had some experience with them at previous jobs. I'm going to let Brandon answer this question.
So
I remember what
I'll take that. Yeah, I'll take that question 2 ways. So there's obviously the software that you're running to configure and manage your NAS, but there's also the hardware portion of it. So me personally, I don't have what you would call like an out of the box NAS that you could buy from, Newegg or something like that. That's just a, basically a small PC with a bunch of drive bays. I'm using a full blown server, an actual server that has drive bays, but it's, anything's a NAS, I guess, if you, say it is. But
Yeah.
in terms of software, I personally use Open Media Vault, OMV. I try to use, there's nothing wrong with Synology. The one reason that I use OMV is it kind of ticked the boxes that I was specifically looking at the time, at least. And not things have changed. I could probably move away. I think mostly because Synology and a lot of the other out of the box NAS programs that are out there now, a lot of them rely on Docker to you can basically just run your own Docker containers, mini VMs basically right on the NAS, and it's all kind of integrated and you're in that ecosystem. And it's a really good option for people who are just getting into it or don't want to have the as much technical overhead where you're managing a separate VM and a separate everything. Just it just kind of puts it all in one spot. You're not trying to overthink things. But that's not me, so I overthink everything. So I just have everything else. But yeah, because I already had a whole stack of Docker containers, me moving to something like Synology or things like that had all those extra features, those were kind of unnecessary features for me. And yeah, I could have migrated everything over, but there's also part of that if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of thing. So I know how my system works, and I'm keeping it there.
Another question from Donnie. I don't know if you guys want to take this or park it for a minute.
No, you can take that one.
Yeah. I only have a single host, which isn't great, but at the same time, I mean, it's an older Dell box. It actually came out of it was used to be a web server for a audio company based out of Tennessee. Picked it up off a pretty cheap, had a decent amount of, didn't come with drives or anything like that. But it's got, I think I got 96 cores to play with and, 300 gigs of RAM. So it's got some movement to it, and it won't last forever, I'm sure, but it is what it is. But virtualization is key. Like I said, I use Proxmox as my hypervisor. I run 5 separate VMs. One of them is a standard Windows VM. One's a Linux VM. And then I have specialized ones, one for my NAS, one for Home Assistant by itself, and then one for it's called AMP, which is like a game server management software that kind of lets you just spin up pretty much a server for any game you want, and with very simply and very quickly. So virtualization's the key. I would never go non-virtualized ever.
My answer on that, I haven't done nested virtualization. I almost did. I almost built Dockers on a VM inside of my hypervisor because you can. But in my case, I have 2 separate servers. So I have a physical NAS, and then I have my primary host that the primary host does all the computational work in the network pretty much. The NAS does some of the smaller stuff in Docker. I do run Nextcloud in it. I saw some mention of Nextcloud in there, which is great. And for Nextcloud, think of it like Google Drive, but hosted in your house. It's pretty great. I like it a lot. It has strengths and weaknesses. There's a lot of configuration, but I don't want to go too deep into that unless people really want me to. Also, TrueNAS is great. But yeah, nested virtualization I haven't really gotten into, but I also haven't needed to because I have multiple hosts, and I'm actually planning on probably adding another one in the next month or 2. I just haven't decided if I will add another one that's big enough to do everything that my current virtual host does and then some, or if I'm going to just add it as an additional and have 2.
So here's a question for you guys. We have Donut Works. What's up?
Yeah,
Craigslist Labs for the win.
Yeah.
When you guys are looking for new hardware and new parts and things, where are you going to look?
Craigslist is a great option. If you're on Facebook Marketplace can have some pretty decent leads. Not saying that they're the best, and you got to deal with. I mean, Craigslist got scammers too, but Facebook's pretty bad for that stuff. But there's a lot of forums, the Discord communities that are around it, Reddit communities that are formed around it. Swapping hardware and word of mouth.
I think r/hardware swap exists.
Yeah. I've actually gotten a couple graphics cards from there. So back in the days where graphics cards were, didn't grow on trees. So yeah, it's definitely there's a lot of options. Obviously, there's the option to buy brand new. If you have the money, it's definitely an option. But if you're just getting into home labs, I probably wouldn't recommend that unless you're just, like I said, you're willing to go for it. Go for it. That's not for me. Hey, absolutely. That's
easy win. I've done it before. In fact, I have 3 or 4 of them. Maybe it's only 2. I have a handful of them in my NAS right now. Old 8 terabyte data center drives that were refurbished with a warranty, and I've had 0 issues with them.
What about on the software side? We can go back to hardware too if people want to in the comments want to do that. But I was thinking as you were describing virtualization and managing VMs and as those start to add up, and you're all of a sudden now you're managing updates for them and everything too, and security concerns maybe. Any advice there?
For my side, if you're not using something, because I tend to do this a lot because I like to tinker. So I'll spin up a Docker container or a VM that does something just because I want to see what it does and how it works. And I'll mess with it for maybe for a couple days, and I move on to something else. Probably one of the most important things I could say there: if you're not using it, turn it off. I've gotten burned on that before, and even just something as simple as you start dealing with integrations into when you start crossing VMs paths, and just a Home Assistant, for instance. I use Ubiquiti network gear, and it all ties into Home Assistant great. The one thing that Home Assistant will do, though, is it will try and update your Ubiquiti gear for you. And that's not always so great. So you have to, and you're not always going to know that, and, you turn update, auto update all on, and you're just like, oh yeah, why wouldn't I want to keep it updated? Until all of a sudden you come in and your access points aren't working and you don't know why. I was like, well, you get the family asking why the Wi-Fi is down. And you have to come up with a really good excuse. Oh, the power must have went out or something. Not that, I forgot to check a box somewhere along the line and that's broke everything. But yeah, it's, I'd say that's a good way of just, trying to make sure things are shut down, that they're not being utilized. And probably having a plan of, trying to check in on things. And I think everybody's guilty for not thinking they have enough time to do things. You put the time in, you set it and forget it and you hope it's going to be good. But I mean, a personal problem that I have, my Linux VM, it tends to, and this isn't necessarily, it's a hardware backup problem on my side. I have an external drive that I do some camera stuff with, and every once in a while it disconnects for no reason that I can ever find, other than it's old and needs replaced. But it's literally just there to dump camera files on temporarily, and then it wipes it immediately. So it doesn't really do anything. The problem is when it disconnects twice a year, it has to where I have that mounted in that VM. That VM hard drive is only 120 gigabytes, and all of a sudden that drive fills up very quickly, and then it just quits working. So, it's one of those things. I would say having a plan of saying, hey, you know what? It's maybe every other Monday or something like that. Go through your list. Is there any pending updates? Is there anything that looks like it might break if you do update it? If you'd have to take a bigger, look at it at the bigger picture, then do so. Have a way out if necessary. Make sure that if updating this thing is not going to ruin your week trying to fix things.
Anything you want to add there, Ian? And then we got another question here from Donnie. Donnie, thanks for asking all these questions. This is great.
Yeah, that is a really good question. So on the software side, I'm definitely going to agree with Brandon, because again, it's one of those, like, it's easy to say, I don't have time, right? I don't have time to look at it. And that's awesome until something breaks and you're like, man, you're looking at logs and you realize that it was giving you signs of breaking for like a month and a half, and you just never noticed it because you weren't spending enough time in it. And that's something, I think, making a schedule, as crazy as it seems, right? If you have a home lab, tinkering is a lot of fun and it's great. But if you have a home lab that's providing services to you that you use all the time, you need to put in the same amount of time to maintaining those as you would if you were getting paid to provide those to somebody else. Because without, like Brandon said, without the proper maintenance, you're going to run into issues. If you're not spending enough time looking at it, you're going to run into issues. That's one of the core reasons that I have, I forget what it's called. What's our status tracking Docker that we use, Brandon? I think we both use the same one.
Uptime Kuma.
Uptime Kuma. Yep. Uptime Kuma that keeps track of a bunch of the services that I'm running. And then I have Teams alerts or Discord alerts set up because I run a couple of game servers for some friends in Discord groups. And so I have Discord alerts that if some of those servers go down, it pings our Discord and says, hey, shit's broke. And that type of thing can definitely be worth the effort. Obviously, it's ideal to look at those things before it comes to that point, right? Like you want to know that it's breaking before it's offline. But just having a status tracker like that can make a huge difference in managing things. And then, I mean, I also have Ninja at home on the home lab, and I've had that since long before I worked here. Having alerts set up within Ninja for the home lab is great. Albeit it's a bit expensive. Obviously, it's an enterprise tool that I'm using at home. There's a cost associated with that.
Yeah, and I know we this came up in the Discord, right? I think a lot of folks hear these same names, right? This is something that I would love to figure out a way around, is for us to have something where we can encourage folks, enable them to have Ninja on home labs without it being so cost prohibitive. So more to come, hopefully, on that.
The internal discussion continues. Moving on to this question.
All right, so this is from Donnie. Donnie, thanks again. Virtual firewall or bare metal?
You know, for me personally, I deal with firewalls for work all day, and I really hate dealing with firewalls for work all day. So
don't miss that.
Right. If you have the time and the patience to go into doing something, you know, in your own system and having it configured and knowing what's going to break and what kind of rules you want to set up, you know, I think that's the biggest thing, is I don't want to say confidence level, but the willingness to learn, because you start dealing with a lot of things that, you know, and there's a lot of nice out of the box experiences out there. But, you know, if you're willing to take that leap, I think it's a great idea either way, really. I mean, I am personally just using, you know, the built-in Ubiquity stuff at my house, and that's, you know, it's fine. It's not the greatest. Obviously, there could be other ways. There's way better ways to protect things. And we can get into this a little bit later, but probably one of the biggest things that I used to be really guilty for and now refuse to do it is port forwarding. And I don't port forward anything anymore. You know, I have my core web server that's forwarded because it has to be. But other than that, I don't have a single port that is open on my network. And I know many people. Proxy. Yes. I know plenty of people who just blindly open ports because a YouTube video tells them to, and they have no idea what it says. So like, open up this port range because your game is slow or something like that. Well, guess what? That video is 9 years old, and those ports haven't been used in 9 years, and you have no idea what you just opened up, and you're giving full range to that device on your network. But yeah, so that's my take on it.
Yeah. So for virtual versus hard or bare metal, I've done a little bit of both. And in fact, I was, and probably will still at some point, going to stack both of them. So I also use a Ubiquity stuff. I've got a UDM Pro that I'm using that does all my firewall stuff, and I have a bunch of the settings turned on because I'm paranoid. Also, on a list of advice of things to not do when building a home lab, don't spend too long looking at your firewall logs because it will make you afraid of the world. It's genuinely terrifying for me to look at prior to setting up geofencing and a bunch of the other rules that I have now. Just looking at the stuff that my firewall was blocking with intrusion detection and prevention was terrifying. So don't spend too long looking at that unless you're actively combating an issue. It will make you very, very, very afraid. In fact, I almost quit home labbing when I did that. Like I almost just killed everything because it was scary. Like we're talking hundreds of assorted attempts to do something a day.
I mean, it's like this, you see all the time, like the stats of having RDP open within minutes, you're just flooded with stuff. It's crazy.
Also, if on Brandon's point for port forwarding, if you're port forwarding, don't use the default port for anything ever. There's multiple ways around that. You can do port redirection. So you can port forward something where the external access is one port, and then use a different port internally. So you don't even have to change the config on the application or anything like that. If you're port forwarding, and I really recommend like a reverse proxy, something more secure than that. Beyond that, for the back to the firewall question, I've done some hardware. I like it a lot. In your specific case, if it were me, I don't like leaving hardware on the table ever. And even if I would never use it, I would absolutely virtualize that just so that I had some extra horsepower sitting in a corner. If I wanted to spin up a Docker for something simple. A great example for that specific case might be maybe you put your reverse proxy in a Docker container or a VM on that same hardware as your firewall, just because you have the resources there, and then it keeps kind of all of your network stuff in one place. To answer that more specifically.
Were there any, like, as you're learning these things, both of you guys, making mistakes, figuring things out on your own, learning that way, but were there go-to resources? I mean, I know that there's like a bajillion YouTube channels, there's especially around home labbing, there's so much, right? But yeah, anything that kind of like was a go-to resource for you?
I mean, I think it just depended. For my home lab, the very beginning of my whole home lab experience started off with, I didn't want to spend $50 a month for someone else to tell me my cameras were working or them not working and then not be able to do anything about it anyways. So I found I needed to find a way to have security cameras at my house that, I could deal with, manage locally, and then also be able to view remotely. So when you start it there, you just kind of have to open up whatever resources are available. You have to kind of do your own research. Now, there's lots of different, subreddits and, Discord channels, GitHub repositories out there for all kinds of different things. But I think it all depends on what it is that you're trying to find to begin with. Like, my foray into this whole experience started on a Raspberry Pi. So I was on Raspberry Pi forums. I was never looking at Proxmox virtualization and reverse proxies. I was just trying to get a camera on a computer screen. That's all I was trying to do. And it just evolves further after that. So, where I may have started, you start watching a YouTube video on a tutorial on how to do something standard. Well, then you may find other tutorials of that from that same person, or maybe he suggests watching somebody else and then somebody else. I hate to just give it a blanket term, YouTube, Reddit, and Discord, but at the same time, and GitHub. But that's really where you end up. That's probably, and maybe there is a considerably better resource or something out there that I've yet to find, but realistically, community is probably the best resource.
No, it makes so much sense. I mean, you're going to it not in a more generalized way. Most of the time, you're going for a very specific answer or some very specific feedback.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ian, I saw you answer this in the chat, but I figure I'd toss it to you, Brandon, too. Pre-built virtual appliances. You have any experience messing around with those?
No, I don't have any experience, to be totally honest. I've, like I said, from the very beginning, my home lab was set up to be to provide a service for myself, and then it just became a tinkering thing after that. I think at some point, there's probably a space for that. At some point, my host is going to die. It's unfortunate truth, but it will, and I'll have to move on to other things and move things to the cloud or whatever the case might be. So, like I said, I don't personally have any experience, but it's not saying that it won't ever happen.
How about you, Ian? So you mentioned,
yeah.
The
pre-built virtual appliances thing. It's one of those, like, I hate how much I love them situations, because there's a lot of me that really enjoys the tinker and the setup. But there have been a couple of cases where I've used them, right? And if I'm understanding what Chris is talking about correctly, and I'm pretty sure I am, at one point I was testing out 40Net's virtualized firewall. and they just have a VM it's pre-configured. It just you basically just take a virtual hard drive, you give it the hardware within the recommended specs, and then you slap the virtual hard drive in it, and it goes, and then you just configure it from there. You don't have to do any fancy installation stuff. It's really, 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 really nice. And I've used it in a couple other cases, but I'm going to not talk about them for the case of security by obscurity or via obscurity. To not tell people exactly what is running in the backbone of my home lab. But I've used them in a couple of cases. I like them a lot. Just the simplicity of it it's nice, man. Like sometimes it's nice to not have to tinker with something a lot.
Okay, I've got a couple other questions for you, and then I want to make sure you guys have a chance if there's anything you want to cover before we wrap up here. My first question is, what's, we've all seen like the stereotypical thing of like every guy's got the box, like the drawer of all the cables that they like he refuses to get rid of. Like, what's the one piece in your home lab office or C or whatever that has been sitting there that you will never get rid of, that like you're not using, but you're just never going to get rid of?
I mean, I got a lot of cables.
Me too. I was just thinking about the 2 drawers of cables that are sitting over there just off screen.
I'm looking at the 3 organizers, full floor organizers full of cables that are, at one point used to just be a really bad mess. But in a not so distant past, I sorted every single cable, and they're tied together. They're in different bags. It's all I can pull a drawer and flip them through like a filing cabinet. It's the best thing ever.
This sounds very satisfying to me too. Like I love like doing the dishes. I love jobs that are like, now I see the result of my labor. Like I've done this and now it is done. And I love that kind of work.
Yep. But I mean, that's probably part of it. I would say I have a older Lenovo laptop that sits under my desk, along with a PlayStation 4 and an Xbox One that haven't been turned on in a very, very long time. But they are fully wired up. They go to different monitors. They're set up for capture. Like if I wanted to record something from them, I've done it once, but I have no reason to remove them. I don't probably plan on ever using them, at least in anything I can think of. And then on a totally separate subject, another thing that sits on my desk that doesn't get used is my Steam Deck, because I just don't ever find time to use it.
Oh man, I know, right? Like it's the other thing I've seen shared a lot, which is depressing more than anything, is like, you have all the things that you wanted that you didn't have the money for, and then you do have the money for, and you don't have the time to do it now.
Yep.
Oh,
yep, exactly.
Absolutely a true statement. For me, the thing that'll probably never go away that I really don't use is, and Chris mentioned it earlier, Nextcloud, right? I have Nextcloud set up. I haven't touched or used it in forever. At one point, my sister was using it because she kept running out of space in Google Drive, but then she's an artist and a photographer, and she was using it to back up photos. And one of Nextcloud's weaknesses is that it doesn't scroll images very well. Like its rendering engine is just not awesome. And I spent 3 days trying to make that better with a bunch of add-ons and other stuff. And I got it better, but it still wasn't enough better that she was happy with it. Probably limitations of the very old hardware in that server. So I don't think it's been used in forever. But it's also never going away. At most, I might close it so that it's not available on the internet anymore. But I don't think I'll ever kill Nextcloud unless I rebuild the NAS or something like that. And then I'll just end up with an archive that's Nextcloud and the whole configuration, so I could just put it back in a Docker if I wanted to. Yeah, that's probably my theoretical drawer of cables, not counting the actual drawers of cables.
Yeah. Hey, JG, I'm right with you. I mean, that is the main thing that runs here, and if I couldn't, I would have to keep my cameras. Everything else could probably go. Cameras were where it started, and I have a really a pretty advanced camera setup at this point that does a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. So I couldn't probably go without that at this point. But everything else that I do, it could probably, I have a Docker container that holds code snippets. I could easily keep those in a document somewhere. I don't need to have a virtualized Docker container that is meant for this, but it exists and I have it. Kind of going back to things that are just kind of here. I have a speed test Docker container that just goes out and runs speed tests every 10 minutes. I don't ever look at it, but I know it does it. And every once in a great
that's
while,
built into Unify now, right?
Yeah, but this, you know what? It's separate and it does it, and it's nice, and I know it happens. And like I said, I don't ever really look at it until I'm having a problem, and then I'll go look at it. And like, look at that! My speed tests have been garbage for the last 3 days, and look at that. If I would have looked at it, I would have known already, but I didn't. So it just kind of runs.
We've got coming around to the end of the hour here, and I'll make sure you guys have another chance to say anything else that you want to make sure that we talk about or cover or leave people with. But I got one last question for you, and it's at the risk of being, man, super capitalistic, and like I'm totally like this is just the context. I'm a victim of it. I don't, at the risk of like making a hobby a thing that you can do purely for just enjoyment in your own personal gratification, squeezing like value out of it, or like it has to contribute to like some other form of value. What are some lessons do you think that like that maybe like how is messing around, building a home lab, testing things out, learning how things work, how has that helped you on your professional side? Do you think it's been beneficial in any way there?
I think it's immensely beneficial. And I'm sure Ian agrees. I mean, my home lab started out with purely just because I needed to fix cameras. But going through it, and setting up, a NAS and setting up all these different, I am mostly self-taught when it comes to most of those things at the very beginning of things. So having that knowledge that I self-taught, I definitely learn by doing. I can sit there and read something 100 times and it doesn't really mean anything to me until I actually do it. So, in previous jobs, something would come up and I'm like, you know what? I've done this before. Or maybe I haven't done this before, but, maybe I will go try and figure out how I could do this at home, if it even, whether it has any worth to me or not. And then at least take examples of it or take steps that I've learned along the way and then, use that in a, professional environment. It happens daily still for me, and from both directions, things I learned in my professional career that I can bring back to my home lab. Like, you know what? We do this a certain way now, and that makes so much more sense. Or this new tool came out, I'm going to use that tool too. I mean, it's perfect. It does exactly what I want. I think they go hand in hand. If you have the time and the ability and the the want to do it, it's probably the best way. Really, it's like having paying thousands of dollars to go do lab courses somewhere on how do I use a switch? Well, right here, I'm going to figure it out right now at home,
right in front of me.
Really well said.
So my stance on it, right, is I've always, and as Brandon said, right, mostly self-taught, except for in my case, it's like a completely self-taught. I don't have a college degree for IT. I was a sysadmin. I did a lot of really high level work because I did it at home first and I knew how things worked, and that was how I learned. So from the capitalistic perspective for me, right, I compare the cost of my home lab to the cost of a college degree. And my home lab, probably, all things considered, is like, I've probably spent between $5,000 and $7,000 on it, if I had to guess, right, over the course of time. And that seems like a lot, but I did it over several years. 5 or 6 years was the course of most of that. And then I compare that to the cost of a college degree, right? What would I have spent on a college degree instead? And then realistically, for an entry-level college degree, what would I have learned in comparison? And I've had some ups and downs in interviews with different companies. Some companies care a lot more about having a college degree than others, and other companies are like, wait, you're self-taught? Like, let's talk about that. And then they ask questions that might be really difficult for people that have a college degree, but might be really easy for me. And sometimes it's vice versa, right? There have definitely been cases where there's terminology or like fancy buzzwords that I'm like, what the hell does that mean? And then somebody tells me, and I'm like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. I just didn't know your fancy word for it. So I think that home labbing is the best way to learn. I'm not going to tell anybody not to get a college degree. If that's the course that you want to go, I say go for it. But I will say that I didn't get a college degree. I have zero college debt, and I'm very content with where I'm at with and what I know just from teaching myself.
That's awesome.
Yes, I actually have that running in my lab right now and can show you. Is a great interview go to.
Yeah, I mean, this is where too, like seeing the I think you see this more for like cybersecurity stuff, but having the talent crisis or talent shortage and everything is just like, maybe you just need to look in other places, right, and be more open to people and their experiences. Yeah, man, I'm glad. Thank you guys for both sharing that. Anything else that you want to cover that we had planned on that we didn't get to, or anything you want to kind of leave on?
I have a super quick note that I want to make sure that I got to say that I had in my personal notes is one of the biggest home lab mistakes that I made was not planning for scale. I like planned for it to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to do these like 3 little things. Plan in a way that allows you to grow the lab, because there's a pretty high chance if you're the type of person that's starting to build a lab, you're probably the type of person that's going to continue to build a lab, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger. So it's important to go into it with the mindset of doing it right, building it with scale in mind, and taking a more professional approach. That's something like every time that I do something now, I look for the right way to do it. I investigate the right ways to do it. I investigate the more enterprise business grade solutions, at least in terms of a how to do it. Maybe I don't spend money on the enterprise grade software, but I want to implement it correctly because I'm going to have to manage it for a long time. So having a more, I guess, businessy mindset when I'm building it, or when you're building a home lab, I think is something that I really wish that I had done.
I'll take that like in a slightly different direction. I don't want. I think that I totally agree, but at the same time, I think that that shouldn't be a barrier to entry. If somebody drops off a computer on the side of the road and you need to throw a couple hard drives in it, and it's anything, getting yourself on something to try to learn with, if that's what you're willing to do, it's a great way to just look at it. I mean, I started out on a Raspberry Pi, then I started off with a computer, a dumpster, it was on its way to a dumpster. Grabbed it, threw in an SSD, and started messing with it, and then that grew to something a little bit better and something a little bit bigger. And then at some point you might end up with an actual, dual blade server, sitting in a rack underneath your desk, or maybe you won't. It just kind of depends. But I think, and I think also, kind of going throughout this whole thing here, don't be afraid. I think we've said, oh yeah, you make mistakes. It's a lot of money, takes a lot of time. But man, the fruits of the labor at the end are really good. It's like one of those things like you beat that boss level in a video game, and you're like, I feel like that a lot of times when I don't have to touch anything all day, I won, right? Like I don't have to do anything. Everything worked today, and I have way more of those days than I don't have those days. We're talking, 3 days a year where they're like, oh man, something broke. What happened? And having a plan, usually fixes those pretty quick, and it's usually just because power was out, UPS failed, internet provider died, and something didn't fail over. Usually stuff out of your control. But I think either way, take the dive. If you're looking into learning or trying to fix a problem, just take the dive.
Yeah, and I'll preface, I'll like restate what I said. Don't let it stop you from getting into it, but plan for scale where you can, I guess, is a better way to say it, right? When you're building a software, don't close out the possibility of adding other things. If you ever think I might want to add this in the future, and maybe I should not give this VM all of my storage, and I should just give it a fraction or a portion that it's just the portion it needs, probably do that, because chances are you're going to do the thing. Chances are you're going to expand out. And yes, don't pick up random computers from the road and use them.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking time. One thing, like, just to wrap this up, Brandon, you mentioned community being like the best source of what I think is awesome about this topic for sure, because there's a huge home lab community out there with people sharing things, but it also applies into the IT world in general, and certainly the MSP world and everything we're doing with Ninja. I just want to once again give a shout out to everybody in our Discord, and if you want to join, you should. It is we've got like over, I think it's up to like 6,000 now. Folks that are in there, and it blows me away all the time how constructive everyone is and encouraging, how much everyone's sharing. And so I just want to call that out. Come join us. It's a good time. And if you're already in there and you think we can do other stuff, give us some feedback, like more streams like this, more conversations, anything that you think we can be doing. Let's leverage some of these Ninja resources and let's put it to good use.
And I'm there too, so you can ask me home lab questions if you didn't get to ask your question today.
100%. Yes, you can tag Ian. He is in there. You can bug him at all hours. Maybe not all hours. Sorry, Ian.
Maybe. I answer when I can.
Yeah. Brandon, thanks so much. It was great meeting you. And
thanks,
I would love to have you back sometime. And thank you for everybody, all the familiar names and the new ones in the chat here too. Really appreciate it. We'll be back in, I believe, a couple weeks. We'll update the schedule in our Discord, also at ninja1.com/events. You'll be able to check out the schedule there. Definitely building out our agenda for more live streams coming in the summer. I think our next one is actually all around MDM, which we just launched. So you'll be able to talk with Josh Schofield, who is the product manager of MDM, and he's going to answer all sorts of questions and give some sneak peeks. It's one thing we like to do is give folks who are tuning in the live stream a little bit of a behind the scenes view on some things. So yeah, more to come. But in the meantime, thanks everybody. Happy Thursday, Little Friday, and take care.